Good morning and or good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you are joining us from. Um, we are, as people start to filter in, we have an hour, so I want to get started on time and make sure we can maximize our time here. For those of you who don't know me, I am Jenny Town. I'm a senior fellow here at the Stimson Center and director of our Korea program and 38 North. I should note that this is June 25th, which marks the 74th anniversary of the outbreak of the Korean War, a war that still remains an armistice with no formal durable peace for a divided nation. And one of the developments that it really has been exacerbating the security situation on the Korean Peninsula currently is the growing cooperation between Russia and North Korea, especially in the military realm. We have seen this progress. We have seen this relationship progress in recent years, and especially since Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022. North Korea is one of the few countries that has been unwavering in its political support for Russia since the beginning of that war, and had expressed a willingness to provide material support as well from very early on. And while Russia seemed to only appreciate the sentiment at first, it has since become dependent on North Korea's munitions and weapon support for prolonged warfighting in Ukraine. But none of that comes free, of course. And we've seen Russia reciprocate political support for North Korea, especially at the UN Security Council, blocking new sanctions and recently vetoing the mandate renewal for the UN panel of experts, which monitors implementation of sanctions against North Korea. We've also seen increased political exchanges, renewed levels of trade and aid, tourism, and military cooperation. And last September, that cooperation was undeniable as Putin and Kim met in the Vostochny Cosmodrome in the Russian Far East, followed by tours of Russian military aircraft factories. And there's certainly ample evidence of arms shipments from North Korea to Russia, with North Korean munitions, small arms, and even missiles being recovered from the battlefield in Ukraine. So the last time Putin went to Pyongyang was 2000, when he downgraded the defense aspects of the bilateral relationship. But last week, we saw Kim and Putin upgrade their partnership, restoring the mutual defense pledge, as well as create the mandate for deepening cooperation across political, socioeconomic, cultural, technological, and defense areas. This comprehensive strategic partnership treaty, as they have called it, has caught the relationship up to what we have seen evolve in practice in recent years and sent a strong message of solidarity between the two in their defiance of international law and norms and in their push for a multipolar system. So today, I'm pleased to be joined by several of my Stimson colleagues to talk through various aspects of what this upgrade in relations means for North Korea and Russia in particular, as well as for regional security dynamics. I'll keep their intros brief as their full bios can be found online. But our speakers in order of appearance will be Rachel Min-Young Lee, who's a senior fellow in our Korea program and 38 North. She was formerly a North Korea collections expert and analyst with Open Source Enterprise, and most recently headed engagement and network building efforts at Open Nuclear Network. Vladimir Ivanov is an adjunct senior fellow at Stimson and leads programmatic activities aimed at promoting better understanding between Russia and other countries to avoid inadvertent conflict escalation and enhance policy alignment on issues of common concern. Prior to joining Stimson in 2021, he served as the director of the Russia and US program at the East-West Institute for over 20 years, leading EWI's Moscow office. Yoon Sun is a senior fellow and co-director of our East Asia program and director of our China program. She's well known in the field, and her expertise is in Chinese foreign policy, US-China relations, and China's relations with authoritarian regimes. Previously, she has held positions as a visiting fellow at the Brookings Institute and a China analyst for the International Crisis Group. And last but certainly not least, Yuki Tatsumi is a senior fellow and co-director of our East Asia program and director of our Japan program. She's focused on Japanese defense issues and Taiwan, and has previously served as a research associate at CSIS and a special assistant for political affairs at the Embassy of Japan in Washington. So as you can see, we have a star-studded lineup from our Indo-Pacific group here at the Stimson Center, and we're really eager to hear their views. Before we get started, I just want to remind everyone that as we go along, please feel free to put questions in the Q&A box at any time, and we'll get to them after some initial framing remarks. We are also adding in the link to our recent publication of the takeaways from the group you see here today that was published on Stimson Center and 38 North earlier this week, late last week, sometime around there. But with that, let's go ahead and get started. Rachel, I'll call on you first to give us the North Korea takeaways.
Good evening from Seoul, and many thanks to Jenny for the great context to start us off. The summit was surely a win for both North Korea and Russia. From North Korea's point of view, the summit was a huge win on multiple levels. First, by forging a legally binding treaty on comprehensive strategic partnership, Pyongyang managed to put the bilateral relationship on a strategic, longer-term footing. Secondly, Putin explicitly opposed politically driven sanctions and said sanctions against North Korea should be reconsidered. He also said he was not opposed to providing military technical assistance to North Korea, and both of this is a huge win for North Korea. Thirdly, the treaty includes a few military provisions, including Article 3 on opening negotiation channels if either of the two countries comes under a direct threat of armed invasion, Article 4 on providing military and other assistance in case of armed aggression. It is unclear how much physical military involvement could result under these provisions, but the very fact that North Korea was able to get Russia to agree on Article 4 on military and other assistance, which is very similar to a clause from the 1961 North Korea-Soviet Union Treaty, is symbolic enough and provides North Korea extra cover against its perceived external threats, such as the US, South Korea, and even China. Fourth, other clauses in the treaty, such as cooperation in the field of space and peaceful nuclear energy, of course, could result in Russia providing North Korea with technology transfers. The treaty also discusses economic cooperation, including cooperation on special economic zones, which could be another economic opportunity for North Korea. This is concerning not only for potential violations of UN Security Council sanctions, but also for implications for North Korea's longer-term economic policy. The more successful North Korea's economy can be, despite the sanctions still being in place, the less of an incentive Pyongyang has to try to improve relations with the United States. Finally, the visit underscored Kim as an equal to the president of a major power, working shoulder to shoulder to defy a West or a US-led global order. And that cannot be bad for propaganda at home and abroad. From a North Korean messaging point of view, I thought it was interesting that Pyongyang attempted to lock in longer-term relations with Russia. North Korean media cited Kim Jong Un as calling North Korea-Russia relations as an alliance, which is a rare term for North Korea to use, and it was especially interesting because Putin himself did not use the word alliance. So this move seems to have been aimed at underscoring the long-term strategic nature of the relationship that Kim Jong Un deemed was not covered sufficiently by the term strategic partnership, which was the name of the treaty. In terms of the implications of the summit and the treaty, there has been a lot of commentary on the treaty, mostly on the military-related provisions. And I think we should be vigilant about their potential implications for the region and, of course, for the entire world. But we should also be level-headed in that we have yet to see how both sides actually start to implement the treaty. I think one aspect of the summit that we should be talking about more is maybe the more tangible benefits on the economic side, for example, for North Korea, starting perhaps with Russia providing more gas and oil supplies to North Korea. And Putin did say that he was opposed to sanctions against North Korea. And perhaps repercussions for North Korea's munitions industry and how that feeds into North Korea's economic policy in the short to long term. And of course, how all of this plays into North Korea's foreign policy vision, particularly its policy on the US and South Korea going forward. And of course, when we start talking about the repercussions of the opportunities that North Korea sees in its relations with Russia, how these could potentially have far-reaching implications for North Korea's economic reform. And that's all I have for this portion, and I'd be happy to discuss more. Thank you.
Thanks, Rachel. I think it's very clear that there's huge tangible benefits for the North Koreans that came out of this summit. I would like to say too, let's not underestimate what the North Koreans can do on their own on the military technology side. I think we tend to overemphasize what Russian cooperation would bring to the table. But certainly North Korea has made enormous advancements on its own and can continue to do so. How Russia plays into that, of course, could accelerate that process or create more sophisticated technologies, but certainly it's not guaranteed. But given all of those benefits on the North Korean side, Vladimir, I want to turn to you and see what does Russia get out of this? And if an alliance, if both partners in an alliance don't call it an alliance, is it really an alliance? So Vladimir, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Let me start with a couple of personal impressions from the visit, watching the Russian TV. It actually reminded me the realities I lived through in the Soviet Union during Brezhnev times, when we read with great interest the Korea magazine in Russian, spread out in the Soviet Union, depicting this country of actually the victorious communism compared to Russia, where it was expected only in 1980, with a great helmsman leading victorious people of North Korea, with flowers and all these beautiful facades, actually caricaturing this Stalin's cult in a way. And for us Russians at that period, it was in a way comforting that the Russian reality is closer to the actual reality of the world, and the facade was not that beautiful as in North Korea. So we now saw this all reminiscences in how the Russian television depicted the Russian leader's visit to North Korea. But actually, Putin's visit puts a big symbolic exclamation mark, flagging Russia's foreign policy drift to the Cold War patterns, with its great chessboard games, escalation risks, and eventual prospects for peaceful coexistence with the West. Putin permanently referred to 1961 treaty, actually ignoring the 2000 version, which he himself signed. And this flags, again symbolically, a return to his perception to the Cold War era times. Indeed, we remember what soon followed, the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. And we may run the similar risks nowadays, not necessarily in the Asia Pacific, but elsewhere. Not coincidental that just 5 days before the Putin-Kim Summit, a fleet of Russian warships, including a nuclear submarine, visited Cuba. Similar to the great powers competition after the Cuban crisis, escalation risks and increasing strategic stability opportunities are intertwining in what we see during the Putin visit to North Korea. Actually, the Mutual Defense Assistance Clause, in case of aggression, creates some conditions for escalation. But let's notice that it is with bigger caveats than it used to be in the Treaty of 1961, actually referring to the UN Charter and to domestic legislations of North Korea and Russia. In Russia, it is a particularly significant limitation because since 2020 version of the Russian Constitution, Russia declared the supremacy of national legislation over the international laws. And this means that in case of a crisis, it will have to refer to the Russian domestic procedures of declaring a wartime or raising the capacity of its nuclear forces and its nuclear decision strike. Regarding sensitive technology supplies risk to North Korea, yes, Putin acknowledged that he may anticipate this option, but not yet. He actually sent a peaceful message of warning at the same time to the Republic of Korea, not to provide lethal weapons to Ukraine. And this may be a condition for continuing this, or expanding this cooperation with North Korea. Regarding Ukraine, the message is also dual. On the one hand, Putin sends a message that there is a possibility to get North Korea's support and its munitions and other weaponry, taking it to the Ukrainian front. But in case of aggression against Russia, again, not yet. It looks as if Vladimir Putin is raising stakes in anticipation of a major negotiation with the United States and Ukraine. Let's remember the recent peace summit in Switzerland, when just on the eve of this peace summit, Putin held a significant meeting at the Russian Foreign Ministry, announcing its terms for a peace agreement and referring to Istanbul draft treaty of April 2022, which was again very shortly before that published by the New York Times, obviously a leak from Russian foreign policy establishment. Then another implication of this visit, and actually discussed in this context, is a possible change to the Russian nuclear doctrine. Putin mentioned that there is a possibility of reviewing this nuclear doctrine, but not in the sense of first strike capability, but mostly in the use of tactical nukes, referring again to what the West is being developing with regard to the possibility of using tactical nukes in the current circumstances. In this sense, there is also a possibility to get back to strategic stability consultations between Russians and Americans, particularly in the context of the New START treaty expiring in 2026. Well, there was also an interesting developments regarding the UN sanctions on DPRK. Rachel has also already mentioned these developments, but one element is worth noticing. It's the question what's going to become with the nuclear status of North Korea. The treaty no longer speaks about denuclearization or arms control in the Korean Peninsula, which the previous treaty did. And so it is quite possible that Russia goes ahead to advance the concept of recognizing the full nuclear status of North Korea. On the economic side, I would say that this opening of North Korea to the world through cooperation with Russia and China is progressing. And we can see quite a significant positive development, apart from circumventing sanctions, to engage North Koreans in trilateral and more expanded cooperation, where there is also a possibility for South Koreans to engage with North Koreans again in the multilateral context. In this respect, I would like to mention the Tumen River cooperation, mentioned both in Xi-Putin discussions earlier and during his visit to North Korea. You know that there is a so-called GTI, Greater Tumen Initiative, which started in 1995 involving 5 countries, including DPRK, which later withdrew from this cooperation. But there is a possibility to expand this big infrastructural cross-border cooperation project. Finally, I would like to conclude that I mentioned that Russia is looking back into the Cold War, but it's not exactly the same situation. Basically, we can call it a hybrid foreign policy, which takes note of a more complex world context, the increased role of China as the new significant center of gravity. It's no longer a bipolar world, and Russia is currently competing for attention from the so-called global South and global East, as it calls it. And it also announced the project of the big Eurasian partnership to include not only its new Asian allies or potential and broader allies from the global South, but also to include Europe and NATO. So in this sense, Russia follows the strategy of Eurasianism. First of all, securing its positions in the former Soviet states and its periphery in the current context, but not excluding to again rejoin with Europe, including the NATO countries. And it's also interesting that Putin mentioned during one of his presentations, particularly the foreign ministry, that we need to work together in order to limit the presence of external forces in Eurasia, obviously referring to the United States. But again, it doesn't exclude Russia's increased presence in other parts of the world, including the Caribbean, the South America, and most importantly, Middle East and Africa. And let me conclude with just one question, again referring to the current version of the Treaty on Comprehensive Strategic Cooperation or Partnership. It no longer mentions the Korea unification goal. The Korean unification goal was mentioned in 2 previous versions of the treaty. So now it has been taken away, and it obviously reflects the recent North Korea's change in its policy towards unification. I'm particularly working with a number of South Korean and Mongolian and American colleagues on promoting the unification goal on the Korean Peninsula. So I wonder what's going to happen with this cooperation stream under this new situation, both through North Korea policies and Russia rejoining this policy by excluding the notion of Korea unification from the treaty. Thank you. Look forward to further discussion.
Thanks, Vladimir. Certainly there's a lot in there to ponder over. And of course, the unification issue is both the unification issue and the lack of language on denuclearization are pretty important policy changes in Russia's approach to North Korea. I think, there's been a lot of focus on the return to this mutual defense stance and clause in Article 4, and whether this invokes the same kind of sentiment that existed in the 1961 understanding of the treaty, because the language is very similar. But what does it actually mean in practice? And how much? I think it's very clear that the North Koreans are very willing to help the Russians if and when needed, however they can. I do wonder if the Russians are equally willing to help the North Koreans. And that is an open question, I think, that we obviously won't answer today, but something that the Chinese have really tested the strength of over the years, and especially back in 2017, for instance, with the mutual defense clause that's there, but the warnings to Pyongyang if they started it that China wouldn't help. But if the U.S. started anything during the Fire and Fury era, that China would be there. So Yoon, there's always a lot of questions of what is China's take on all of this? How are they viewing the situation? Is this competitive in that process with the Russians when it comes to spheres of influence, and especially North Korea? And how what do they make of this new treaty arrangement?
Thank you, Jenny. Yes, indeed, there has been, well, I feel that there's as much focus on China from the Putin's visit to DPRK as on the visit itself. And the usual question that you hear is that, well, China is a loser in this. China is being pushed out by Russia and DPRK. Well, if you look into the details, not necessarily, not really, right? Because if you look at the role that China plays in both economies, those roles cannot be replaced by either party, simply because they don't have the capacity. And China will stand as the largest economic patron for both countries. And again, not something that can be easily replaced. But if you look at, well, I think it is fair to say that China does have some discomfort and some uncertainty, especially given how unpredictable both Russia and North Korea have been strategically. And also given the history, I think in China, there's a vivid memory of how China had been manipulated by both Russia and DPRK, sometimes jointly, sometimes independently, throughout history since the end of World War II, right? So I think for China, there is this sore memory about China being manipulated by these two countries. So when these two comes together, I think it inevitably will invoke some feelings, especially among the Chinese strategists who have those memories. But if you look at specifically at this visit, how does deliverables from this visit impose or affect or undermines China's national interest? I think that's a question that that has not been really clearly answered by these skeptics of China's role in all this. So if you look at, for example, China's official position, the official position is actually quite aloof in a way. China has the Chinese Foreign Ministry has publicly said that Russia and DPRK, they have normal needs to conduct exchanges, cooperation, and development of their relations because they're neighbors. And the senior visits between Russia and DPRK, they are bilateral arrangements between two sovereign states. And the implied message, of course, this is a bilateral matter between Russia and DPRK, and China doesn't have a position or role in it, which is a fair position that this is between China and DPRK. Why would China have a role to veto or oppose these type of senior level visits? But if you look at the specific details and the deliverables from the visit, I would say most of the deliverables don't have a direct impact over China yet. We'll have to look at what happens later, right? After all, we do recall that Putin visited Beijing 1 month before he visited Pyongyang, which more than anything demonstrates that Russia's prioritization of China over any other country in its current diplomatic playbook. And regardless of the economic or political consensus reached during Putin's trip to DPRK, neither Russia nor DPRK could replace China in the critical role it plays in both economies, or I would even argue in the international arena. And that is also reassuring. The potential troubling aspect for China is obvious. China has had a monopoly of influence over both. And if had the option, I would say China would prefer to maintain that monopoly of influence. So the warming ties between Russia and DPRK it do not necessarily equate to their desire to antagonize China or isolate China, but they could embolden Russia and DPRK, who otherwise would need to be more prudent. But it's not all bad news for China. I think that's one aspect that people don't always recall, because the warming ties between Russia and North Korea, first and foremost, they create more problems for the United States, right? Not first and foremost create more problems for China. So they will bolster this anti-US coalition, and they will further distract the United States from the strategic competition with China on top of the Ukraine war and on top of the Middle East crisis. So last not least, I would say China will not have to be the only patron or the only supporter of both countries who are now basically international pariahs. And China doesn't need to be the only one carrying the water for them diplomatically moving forward either. So what the Chinese have been very careful throughout last year's Putin's engagement with North Korea and Putin's engagement with China is that China has been very carefully framing the relationships among the three countries as three independent and distinct bilateral relationships, rather than one trilateral relationship. So China wished to keep its options open, rather than being cornered or being bogged down by Russia and DPRK in a bipolar arrangement in Northeast Asia and a broader regional or even global power equilibrium, because that will eliminate China's chance to maintain good relationship with the West, especially Europe, Japan, and South Korea. So China has been working very hard to influence the external alignment choices of these US allies and partners and try to pull them into the Chinese orbit. A trilateral coalition with Russia and DPRK will eliminate that possibility. So the most tangible outcome from the trip that could potentially have an antagonizing effect over China is this mutual defense agreement that Russia and DPRK signed, right? Given that China has maintained a mutual defense treaty with North Korea since 1961, the Russia-DPRK pact could potentially drag China into conflict against its preference. So in the past, China only had this arrangement with DPRK, but if DPRK is committed to come to Russia's defense, if Russia is under threat, then that would have implications for China, right? So the language of this mutual assistance clause still carries a lot of ambiguity, and China has always maximized its own flexibility in interpreting the language of its own treaty with North Korea. Like Jenny, you have pointed out that in 2017, Chinese have implied that, well, it depends on how the military threat or how the crisis originated. If it's North Korea's own initiation, then the Chinese implementation of the mutual defense clause would be questionable. So therefore, this Russia-DPRK treaty does not necessarily have China cornered, but the discomfort for China would be understandable and is quite obvious based on the implications of these two documents. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Ian. That's really helpful. Obviously, South Korea has reacted very negatively to the developments last week, as they have with the deepening Russia-North Korea relations over the past couple of years. And so I think solidifying that and putting that on paper has really created a real flashpoint for South Korean thinking about the situation and their own relationships with Russia. And potentially with rethinking relations with China as well, depending on how the situation unfolds. The other piece in this equation, of course, is Japan in the region as an ally to the United States, with deepening relations between South Korea and Japan, as well as deepening trilateral cooperation in the security realm, especially against North Korea, as well as other security dilemmas in the region. Yuki, I turn to you to tell us more about how Japan is reacting to all of this and what that means for the regional security sphere.
Good morning. Thanks, Jenny. And good morning, everyone, or good evening, or good afternoon, wherever your time zone that you're channeling us in. Thanks for joining us. And thanks for my colleagues for great insights that they have provided so far. So I'm coming in from a Japan / more of a alliance angle here. But let me start from my what this means for Japan. Is how is Japan reacting? Badly, I think, in short word, short answer. That would be the short answer. But let me put this in a little bit of perspective. So this Japan, this gives Tokyo a great source of concern, security concern, obviously, but and creating a little bit of a complexity moving forward as it tries to navigate how Japan continues to work closely with United States and as they start closely working with South Korea on the very security aspect of it, but while still pursuing the relations and area to cooperate, if possible, with China, like both Japan and South Korea joined China with the CJK summit not too long ago. But first, put this in perspective. North Korea and Russia has an interesting place for Japanese foreign policy. These two are the only two countries so far that Japan still has yet to close the chapter on the World War II. Japan still hasn't signed a peace treaty with Russia. It does have outstanding Northern Territory issues that comes up from time to time. And with North Korea as well, with the divided Korean peninsula, North Korea side of the peninsula and Japan has not really signed anything that articulated that the state of the war has ended and the settlement of the wartime still stands an outstanding issue. But more importantly for Japan and its bilateral relations with North Korea, it does have a decades-long unresolved abduction issue. And what's interesting about these two countries is because these two countries are the only two that still carries a post-World War II legacy for Japan, these strictly bilateral issues so often worked as almost like a spoiler as Japan tried to look for the bigger strategic goal. And you don't have to go back too far. We all remember late Prime Minister Abe, great visionary, put Japan in a new strategic course, but even he caved into this legacy pressure when he was pursuing aggressively to build his relationship with Putin back in 2014, 2015, and kind of act almost like a half in, half out, half-hearted approach as Russia annexed the Crimea, because that was exactly when he was also pursuing a bilateral summit with Putin, with the hope that he might be able to make a substantial progress on these Northern Territory issues. So in a sense, this resurgence of a North Korea-Russia partnership that almost gives Japan a point of clarity in the sense that this effectively shuts down any prospect for Japan to hope for any kind of meaningful progress on any of these issues with these two countries. So that actually takes a significant degree of political heat off of current political leaders in terms of a domestic pressure to solve these issues. So that's the kind of a moment of clarity that I just mentioned in the outset. But at the same time, it does create a little bit of conundrum for Japan as well, because as Japan's interest in the China, Japan, Korea framework and cooperation shows, Japan, like Korea, continues to look for opportunity to maintain stable line of communication with China. Economic ties real, so concerns for complete decoupling and how does Japan navigate through that is real. So this actually could create, from Japanese perspective, an interesting opportunity and a narrow window to re-energize the engagement with China on how to deal with this North Korea situation. But at the same time, given Japan's own security problems with China and Japan's deepening relationship with the US, with whom China is intensifying the tension, it also puts Japan in a little bit sensitive position in terms of balancing act. But what does that mean for Japan, though, in a short term? Like I said, Japan's concern for what it could mean from what North Korea could get out of this deal from Russia is real. Like Jenny mentioned in the beginning, Japan does not underestimate North Korea's indigenous technology when it comes to nuclear missile technologies. It has witnessed the progress in missile program development up close for the last few years. But what Japan really worries is that with the infusion of Russian technology, that could leverage and kind of leapfrog North Korea into actually operationalizing these nuclear weapons that they currently reportedly have. This is kind of like a doomsday scenario that Japan really didn't want to deal with. So this creates a significant pressure in terms of how much more Japan can do to accelerate what it's doing in terms of building up its own defense capabilities. But then also short term, what more it could do to double down on this alliance with the United States, and then continue to aggressively pursue cooperation with the trilateral cooperation with the US and South Korea. And it also actually, in a sense, as we all know, Prime Minister Kishida is not exactly the politically popular prime minister at home. But in terms of the foreign policy, though, this North Korea-Russia realignment almost infuses a revitalized energy into Kishida's argument that about why Indo-Pacific should care about war in Ukraine and why Europe should care about North Korea and China. So it will be interesting for me to see what kind of a message that Kishida tries to convey when he visits Washington in a few weeks to participate with, President Yoon and his counterpart with Australia and New Zealand for the NATO and AP4 summit here in Washington. So I think I'll just stop here.
Thanks, Yuki. That's really helpful framing. And I wonder, Rachel, if we could come back to you just quick, since you're in Seoul now, and you were in Seoul while the summit happened, if you could give us a sense of, how South Korea is reacting to the summit developments. And before you go, I'll give you a second to think about that. Also, Yoon and Vladimir, how then both China and Russia are trying to balance their relations with South Korea, or are they trying to balance their relations with South Korea, especially in the Russian case, in building its cooperation with North Korea? Certainly, even the China and South Korea had their 2+2 right before the summit started. So it'd be great to kind of hear how South Korea has factored into these approaches to North Korea or reactions to North Korea, Russia. But Rachel, if we could start with you, that'd be great.
On a government level, we know that the South Korean presidential office came out and said that in reaction to the treaty, that South Korea could reconsider its position on not providing Ukraine with lethal weapons. And then they seem to backtrack a little bit the next day, saying that whether they reconsider that decision hinges on Russia's next moves. So there have been some questions about whether South Korea might actually start to provide weapons to Ukraine. And I think that kind of underscores the fact that it's going to be very difficult for South Korea, I think, to come to that decision to start providing weapons to Ukraine, unless we see Russia providing sensitive military technology to Pyongyang. I think on the ground level, this has, and well, actually more in the expert community, I think this has brought to the fore again the nuclear debate in South Korea. About the growing threat of North Korea, and now North Korea aligning ever more closely with Moscow, whether having nuclear weapons is really the only way that South Korea can protect itself. So we expected to see the nuclear debate coming back alive even more with the presidential campaign in the US coming up, or the presidential election in November coming up. But I think it's come up a little bit sooner than expected.
Thanks. And certainly especially the provision of lethal military aid to Ukraine is more than just a government decision, right? It would take legislation to be passed in order to overturn the law that prevents it anyway, and getting bipartisan support in the National Assembly right now just seems a pretty tall order. Vladimir, if I could go to you next, how is Russia thinking about South Korea these days, or are they thinking about South Korea these days, and how did they think South Korea would react to this?
Obviously, Russia goes to another level of escalation, understanding the possible reaction from South Korea, but it's kind of trying to leverage its relations with Kim in order to hold South Korea in like negotiation phase, also including different parameters of cooperating with South Korea in economics. I recently heard that there are discussions about the renewal of direct flights from Seoul to Moscow, and this is kind of on another facet of the moon. We'll see what's going to happen, but it looks like that Russia generally conducts currently multi-directional diplomacy with most huge emphasis on its relations with the United States. Russia obviously hopes that it will be able to arrange many and to solve many problems of escalation currently in building the right connection with the United States, particularly in light of what's going to happen in November and who's going to be the next US president. So that's generally Russia's vision. I don't think that Russia expects too much that there will be a deviation on behalf of South Korea with regard to US policy sanctions. But as regards the strategic military relations, of course, it's a critical matter, and it's a matter for pushing South Korea and other players, Western players in the East, I would say, to have consultations with Russia beyond the overall rejection by Western partners of Russia, compared to many countries in the global South. And South Korea will need to take it into account that Russia has gained a lot of territory, I would say virtual territory, but not also virtual, in the global South during the war in Ukraine. It actually showed the world that it wouldn't be correct to declare Russia as a pariah state. And now it drags North Korea into the game too.
I mean, that's a really important point, and I think one that's illustrated really well by the fact that, even last year you had 5 new countries join BRICS, whereas at the beginning of the war in Ukraine, you had, there was pretty widespread condemnation of Russian actions. That sentiment seems to have softened over the years. Yoon, if I could turn to you, and if you could tell us more of how China is trying to balance its relations with South Korea now. And I'm sure in the 2+2, North Korea, Russia had to have come up. And is there anything, that China can do or is in their interest to do about the situation?
Like I mentioned, the Chinese already made it quite clear that this relationship, this development is between Russia and North Korea, right? It's none of China's business, and it's not something that China can veto. It's not something that China has a reason or has a reasonable cause to oppose, at least not just yet. So I agree with you that since the issue did come up in the China-South Korea 2+2, but I think in terms of China's relationship with South Korea, China has much more beef or much problem to pick with South Korea, with especially President Yoon Yun's external alignment policy rather than North Korea or Russia as a most important issue. And I'm sure everyone knows that President Yun's external strategy is very different from his predecessor, President Moon, who developed a rather close relationship with China. So when China looks at the changing posture of South Korea since President Yun took over, and if you compare what China did to President Park after the deployment of THAAD, I think the conclusion is that China has been rather accommodating towards President Yun, despite what China perceives to be his, maybe not hostile, but at least unfriendly strategy or policy towards China. And let's not forget that last month, the China, South Korea, and Japan just had their leadership summit that was hosted in South Korea, right? And this was something that South Korea had wanted to host and had hoped that China would cooperate, and China did. So I would say that China currently its policy towards South Korea is more about accommodation rather than coercion or punishment. So in this case, I think China would say that, well, look, China is not doing much with DPRK at this moment. What you're seeing between Russia and DPRK is as between Russia and DPRK. And China is actually demonstrating a higher than usual level of accommodation towards Seoul. So I don't think that the Chinese would see that South Korea has a major bone to pick with China currently on North Korea. Thank you.
Great. Okay, so we have a ton of questions coming in and about 10 minutes left. So we'll try and get through as many as we can. I think part of this question has already been answered in terms of the influence of Russia, or the influence of China over the Russia and North Korea. I think you laid out very clearly the limits to that and how they see the situation. But the other part of the question was, what should the US government's highest priority to counter the malign influence of Pyongyang, given that it has aligned with Moscow and has Moscow backing now? I wonder if, especially Yuki, do you have any thoughts on this?
Hold on, let me also look at the question so that I don't misunderstand the intent of it.
Basically, what can we do? What can the US government, where should they focus?
Oh, yeah. So I think this also puts Biden administration, at least, in an interesting place as well. Like I mentioned about Japan's case, it could create a narrow window of dialogue with China, very, very focused on this issue moving forward, because seeing the nuclear North Korea emerging as a full, demanding to recognize as a full-fledged nuclear power, is not in China's interest either. Definitely not in U.S. interest, and that's really the interest that they both share. So it could create a narrow window of opportunity for dialogue on this issue, but at the same time, U.S. and China, and I would love to hear Yoon about Yoon's thought on this from China's perspective. Level of the tension is so high, and there's given a presidential this year being a presidential election year. Biden administration would have to take into account of any kind of domestic repercussion of having an appearance of seeking a dialogue with China on anything, even if this is about North Korean nuclear weapons, or Russia and North Korea basically helping each other out in the Pacific and Europe. So that's a complication that I think Biden administration also faces. So like I said, it'll be interesting to see what President Biden may have in store in terms of what he would try to accomplish at the NATO summit, and especially AP4 dialogue, AP4 participating in it. That this will be a great opportunity really for the United States to start talking about really linking its alliance structure in Indo-Pacific and NATO, and something more collective even if it doesn't take a formal shape. But then again, if we go down that route, then you could almost expect that China and Russia also take another step into their own direction. So this is another tit for tat that they have to calculate. But those are the couple of my initial thoughts. But love to hear, you and what she thinks of how China perceived this as potential window to maintain some level of communication with the U.S. in the time of tension.
I think Yoon and Rachel, if you also have any thoughts about what might affect North Korean decision making at this point, but Yoon, we'll start with you.
Sure. Well, thanks a lot, Yuki and Jenny. Well, we always say that coming to North Korea, there's no good solutions, right? There are only bad solutions and worse solutions, or there's no good way out. And when you put North Korea,
bad, worse, and worst, right?
Yeah. It's there are no good way, no good path forward. And when you put Russia into the equation, I think it just exacerbates that reality that there's no good way out, especially given domestic politics and given the parameter that U.S. policy is confined to. But I think this conversation with China, well, we all know where that will go. Once U.S. raises the issue of North Korea with China, China says, okay, so how about Taiwan? Let's put everything together and let's not just focus on this one issue, right? I think the Biden administration has been very keen on persuading China from its continued defense industry cooperation and support of Russia this year. So there are so many issues between U.S. and China, and you can prioritize maybe one or two of them at a given time. Anything more than that, it just becomes a little bit more dysfunctional. So I think in this case, I know that there are conversations on the track 1.5, track 2 levels. But look, the Chinese position on the North Korea issue towards the United States is, well, you got to talk to those people. You got to have a conversation with them. We all know that the next round of provocation is just around the corner. We're waiting for the time bomb to explode, but no one is willing to do anything to stop it before in advance. So I think that's the ugly reality that we're looking at, and the election certainly is a factor that makes engagement just so much more difficult. Thank you.
Thanks, Yoon. Rachel, did you want to add to this? I'll give you the
just very briefly. Just given where North Korea's foreign policy has been going, I think its alignment with Russia, which has become much more visible and significant through the summit, will give Kim Jong Un some more maneuvering space economically, militarily, and politically. We don't know by how much, but it does give him some more maneuvering space, which is not the great news for most of us.
Well, as usual, we have more questions than we have time. And certainly this is an issue that we could talk about for a very long time and still probably not have many answers or solutions to the problem. But I want to thank all of our speakers for joining us. Like I said, it's a great pleasure to be on a panel with all of my Stimson colleagues. I think it was a great showing, again, for our Korea program as well as for our Indo-Pacific group. And I want to thank everyone for joining us in the time zones that they're in, whether it's morning, afternoon, or evening. Our reaction pieces are online on the Stimson website, as well as on 38 North. And given a number of questions here, we will likely do more to try and address a number of different issues that this growing relationship really brings out. So thank you to everyone for joining us, and we hope to see you at a future event.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Goodbye.